Yes.
I'd like to remind you again that this is not an opera or a musical comedy.
Oh.
I'd like to remind you what this contest is about.
I'd like to remind you there is a quiz next week.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to remind you that all the carpets and tapestries were woven by hand in the Honest Valley in northern Turkey.
Now, Hetty Duran, I'd like to remind you of a certain incident which occurred in Tompkins Gulch not 2 years ago.
And I'd like to remind you that you already agreed to it.
Look, I'd like to remind you who I am today.
Mr. Fabrizi, I'd like to remind you that you are still under oath.
I'd like to remind you there's still 2 attack helicopters headed this way.
No, afraid I can't help you,
Mr. Jenkins, I have to remind you that any such timber is the property of the Crown.
Yes.
I'd like to remind you at this time to have your tickets ready for inspection.
I'd like to remind you tickets to all Grand Lakes sporting events are available through the Student Services Office.
Gentlemen, before we get ahead of ourselves, I'd like to remind you all the man we'd be inviting back into this house.
Yes, I do. I'd like to remind you, young lady, about the trailer park or the feline. Remember that? About my houseboat, which I don't have anymore.
May I bring up a point? Before we vote, I'd like to remind you that there's a great deal of sympathy for that little girl, and there are great...
Yes.